Good afternoon. I'm Ed Bain, president of Dominion Energy Virginia. I'm also a proud Hokie. I received my degree in electrical engineering from Virginia Tech. So I owe a lot to this wonderful school, and I'm very happy to join you today. Some of you may not be familiar with Dominion Energy, so let me say a quick word about our company. We provide electricity and gas to more than 7 million customer accounts in 16 states. Dominion Energy Virginia has about 2.7 million of those customers in Virginia and North Carolina. We are a values-driven company. Our core values of safety, ethics, excellence, embrace change, and One Dominion Energy, our term for teamwork, drive everything that we do. We are also committed to safe, reliable, sustainable, and affordable energy, and we intend to reach net zero emissions across our entire company by 2050. Our vision is to build a clean and sustainable energy future for everyone. And that is a big part of what I want to talk to you briefly about today. As the conference materials have noted, the energy landscape is quickly evolving with new opportunities and challenges on the horizon. That evolution is driven in large part by concern over climate change, which we share. Climate change poses a host of risks, from increasing global conflict to rising sea levels. For the energy industry, it means dealing with more severe weather, spikes in demand during heat waves or cold snaps, more powerful storms. We have a responsibility to manage these impacts while we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. All of which means we must change how we do things. The need to deal with changes in generation mix and location, a shift from rotating machines to inverter-based generation, and the difference in those characteristics, and the need for new tools and solutions to manage the grid differently. These changes also raise some public policy issues. I will have a little more to say about those later. But there will also be opportunities if we respond to the challenges of climate change in the right way. The opportunity to build newer, cleaner forms of generation, the opportunity to make the grid more resilient, the opportunity to make transportation much cleaner too, and industry and agriculture. Our company, in fact, the entire power sector, can help with that. But again, we must respond the right way. At Dominion Energy, we aren't waiting. I mentioned our core value of embrace change, and we are doing just that. We are making our operations as clean as we can, as fast as we can, without sacrificing reliability or affordability. We play a critical role in the broader resiliency discussion, from community vitality to national security, and we need to have solutions that cater to the specific needs of customers. I should point out, we already have made tremendous progress. We have retired more than 2,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation. We have cut carbon emissions sharply, well ahead of the average for our industry. We have also slashed methane emissions, and we will continue to cut emissions until we get to net zero. We are rapidly expanding our renewable portfolio. We built our first megawatt of solar generation 8 years ago. Today, we have the third largest solar generation system out of all of our industry peers. We are building the largest offshore wind farm on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. We are investing in storage and energy efficiency, and we are exploring new carbon-free technologies to meet demand when the weather doesn't cooperate. And we intend to do a lot more. Over the next 15 years, Dominion Energy Virginia alone plans to meet the requirements in the VCEA of over 16,000 megawatts of solar, 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind, and 2,700 megawatts of energy storage, nearly 24 gigawatts of renewable energy resources all told. And we are seeking to extend the life of our nuclear power stations, which provide millions of customers with zero carbon baseload generation around the clock. To be clear, this isn't going to be easy. One of the biggest challenges we face is making the grid ready for all of this renewable generation. To begin with, we are simply going to need more transmission capability to move the energy from the wind and solar farms to our customers' homes and businesses. But the grid does not simply need to be bigger. It also needs to be smarter. You are going to hear more about that shortly, so I won't belabor that point. Suffice it to say that the existing distribution grid was designed for one-way energy flow, from the power plant to the customer. The grid of tomorrow must handle two-way flows, intermittent generation, storage, and customer-level distributed energy, such as rooftop solar. We also need to make sure the grid is stronger and more resilient to contend with more intense weather events, as well as threats from outside actors. Dominion Energy is doing a lot of work in that area. For example, by modernizing our transmission and distribution system, undergrounding our most vulnerable overhead distribution tap lines in neighborhoods, and hardening our physical infrastructure and cybersecurity systems. All of this work is extremely technical. As an engineer by training, I find it fascinating. But there is another, less technical side of these changes that is just as important. I'm talking about the human side. We absolutely must ensure that the transition to a clean energy economy protect everyone's interests, not just those of a few. One way to do that is by focusing on environmental justice. We work hard to make sure every community has a meaningful voice in our development process, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. We also want to make sure the transition to a clean energy economy is a just transition. We believe in economic inclusiveness, and we do not want to leave anyone behind. A lot of good people have spent their lives in carbon-intensive industries, so we need to make sure that they have the training, the tools, and the opportunity to find good jobs in the clean energy economy. To that end, our company is partnering with a number of industry groups and educational institutions to help workers keep pace with the changing times. And I should mention too, the important work our company does with Virginia Tech on things like unmanned aircraft inspection technology and the Dominion Energy Research Partnership, which supports the study of renewable and sustainable energy. We are also partnering with Virginia Tech and other universities to develop talent to support this critical work in our industry. For us, this is all about equity. Equity around job opportunities, equity around how we develop and implement projects, equity on how these investments are paid for. Now, earlier I mentioned the public policy implications. I would like to expand on that briefly. As I said before, we have made good progress in reducing emissions. In fact, out of all the greenhouse gas reductions made to date throughout the entire American economy, the power sector is responsible for 92% of them, 92%, and Dominion Energy has helped lead the way. We are doing our part, and we will continue to do our part, but we can't do it alone. We need good public policy support. We have that in some states. Here in Virginia, the Virginia Clean Economy Act has provided the foundation for the solar, wind, and storage investments we will be making in the coming years. And the Grid Transformation and Security Act is helping us build an electric grid that can support the energy systems of the future. We also need good support at the federal level. That means clear, aggressive climate goals, first of all. It means an economy-wide approach, preferably one that includes a price on carbon. Second, it means having the right incentives in place. For an example of what can go wrong when you don't have the right incentives, just look at what recently happened in Texas. That led to equity issues too. In a deregulated environment like that, where is the obligation to serve all customers? A third thing we need at the federal level is aggressive research and development. We need new technologies and solutions to ensure a clean and resilient grid in the future. And fourth, we need a rational regulatory structure. We firmly believe in obeying the law and following the rules. To do that, we need to know what the rules are. We also need to shorten the regulatory approval process. For big infrastructure projects, it can take 4, 5, or even 6 years to complete an environmental review. If we are going to get to net zero by 2050 or even earlier, as some have proposed, we don't have that much time to spare. My point is simply this: utilities have made enormous changes in a short time. We've proved it's possible. We are embracing change. We urge you to do so as well. My time is just about up, so let me finish on a personal note. Despite the challenges our industry faces, I am optimistic about where we're headed. I'm optimistic when I look back and see how far we've come already. We have proved we can execute on our vision. I'm optimistic when I look ahead to the current students at Virginia Tech and other universities and how they will contribute to this journey. They are bright, they are motivated, and they are capable. And they will be a tremendous asset to us all. And I'm optimistic when I look around and see so many interested parties pointed in the same direction. Just about everyone recognizes the urgency of addressing climate change and wants to find solutions. We already stand on common ground, so I look forward to linking arms with you and moving forward together. Thank you, and go Hokies.
It's my privilege to moderate the last panel of the day. I'm Ralph Cavanna of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only person involved in this conference who's had the same job since 1979. This panel, like this conference, is mostly about the future, but I want to introduce the discussion by looking back about a decade and a half through the lens of a Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory report issued just before Earth Day by Ryan Weiser and his colleagues. In 2005, the Federal Energy Information Administration predicted that annual carbon dioxide emissions from power supply in the United States would reach 3 billion metric tons in 2020. In fact, direct power sector carbon dioxide emissions in 2020 weren't 3 billion metric tons, they were 1.45 billion tons, more than 50% below the earlier projections and 40% below actual emissions in 2005. Other metrics also evolved very differently than EIA expected. Fine particle pollution and associated premature deaths dropped more than 90%, and the number of jobs in electricity generation was almost 30% higher. And the nation's annual electricity bill is now almost 20% below the EIA projections from 15 years ago. In sum, a compelling and cost-effective clean energy transition is unfolding much faster than expected. The heroines and heroes of that transition include many involved in planning this conference, and the results are an inspiration to all who will follow them and indeed to all humanity. Anyone who knows me would be astonished if I didn't point out the outsized contribution of energy efficiency investments and standards to this progress. But none of this is any excuse for complacency. Our progress must continue to accelerate, and we have a superb panel assembled to help us do it. I'm going to introduce the members in turn to make opening statements, and then we'll turn to a discussion. Kenyon Wells is Senior Vice President for Solutions and Technology at the Virginia-based consulting firm CGI Federal, where he manages a diverse group of technical, organizational, and business process experts. His particular focus is helping regulatory and industry communities collaborate on solutions that build on secure data sharing, real-time analytics, and what Kenyon calls agile business processes. Kenyon Wells.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you for that great introduction. And I want to thank everyone, the organizers, for this conference and for having me here today. And what a great time to be having this conversation and all the conversations that are being held as part of this conference. There is so much change going on. We all feel it. So much opportunity, as Ralph was just describing, some of the great progress that's been made in the last 15 years. Every day we're seeing huge steps forward specific to technology, but also to the way those services are being delivered to the American public. And so many of the people involved in this conference are at the forefront of that. But what I wanted to talk about today is the ramifications of all that. And I would propose that over the next 10 years, the next 15 years, there's going to be more change to this industry than the industry has experienced over the last 50. And much of that will be driven by the technologies that I and the other panelists are going to speak about. But the technology that's being forced upon us also engenders business changes and changes to the way we all need to operate. And that goes for the actual utilities. It also goes for the regulators of those utilities and how the two interact together, and for organizations such as Virginia Tech and academic organizations that are engaging and supporting both the regulated industry and the regulators themselves. All of these changes are going to happen much quicker than people really expect. I know we all know this. I know it sounds like a cliche, but things are going to be forced upon us that none of us expected. And as part of that, I want to give a bit of a story, a bit of a comparison of another industry that just went through a significant transition and is still going through a significant disruption. Let's talk about retail for a second, the US retail market. For 25 years now, ever since the rise of the internet, the retail organizations across the US have been completely transformed. And especially over the last year with COVID, we've all seen how most of us had to rely so heavily on the Amazons of the world, and primarily Amazon. There's very few of the old retail companies that are still around. If you think about JCPenney's and all these others that used to be such reliable businesses that people built their careers on back in the day, most of them are gone or have been consolidated. And we're really consolidating down to Amazon and Walmart and then everyone else. And I think it's an important comparison that, if you went back 25 years, all those big retail players would not have even considered Amazon, a bookseller, to be viable competition. Now they dominate that industry. I would argue only one of the traditional retailers, Walmart, has really made the shift over to compete in today's environment. And that's because they embraced technology, but even they went through many, many years of very hard times where they were losing market share, losing margin to the new entrants. And only by changing the way they conducted their business and how they embraced that technological change have they been able to be a viable competitor to Amazon. Compare that to our industry, to the utilities industry. You now not only have huge technological changes that are forced upon us because of climate change, because of the natural disasters we see, whether that's fires in California or blizzards in Texas. We know we have to change. We know we have to adopt these new technologies and these new ways of performing these services. But you also have new entrants. So I'll give the example of Tesla, who is now entering into this market space. And something that might have slid under many people's radar is last week, Elon Musk, in his preferred communication style, which is a tweet, announced that they were only going to be selling their power walls, that's their home batteries, bundled with solar going forward. You think about the ramifications of that. That means they don't want to just be a player of we sell solar panels, we sell the outcomes. They want to be a service provider where the people who purchase their products can produce their own power, store their own power, and sell it back to the marketplace. And Tesla isn't just producing batteries and solar panels, they're producing the software that runs it. And the AutoBidder software allows them to automatically sell for the best possible price the power back to the grid. That is going to be transformative as that rolls out. And there are many other players similar to Tesla that are entering into this market. So as the rest of the fine panelists here present, each is going to talk about different technologies, but I would urge you all to think about how you're embracing these technologies and how you're acting in a more agile fashion. And this is where the regulators come in as well. In the IT world, we talk a lot about acting agile as opposed to the old waterfall approach, where you have to design something, then implement it, and then roll it out. Because of the current regulatory regime and the fact that everything has to be based into those rate structures and rate justifications, it forces the utilities to act in a very pre-planned waterfall approach. The regulators need to understand that the utilities need flexibility to embrace the technologies that they need to roll out to compete with companies like Tesla. So with that, I'm going to pass it on. I urge you all to ask me the hard questions, ask for more details when we get to the Q&A. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Back to you, Rob.
We're going to turn next to Bob Cummings. I'm going to alert my other panelists that we may have to move Matthew Gardner back because he's having some technical issues. So Dongzin, be prepared to come in after Bob, please. Bob Cummings retired from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation in April 2020 after over 23 years of service as NERC Senior Director of Engineering and Reliability Initiatives. He was a principal investigator of the 2003 Northeast blackout and the more recent September 2011 Arizona Southern California outage. He's a member of the U.S. Department of Energy Electricity Advisory Committee and its Energy Storage and Smart Grid subcommittees. Bob Cummings.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sometimes I get called Blackout Bob, there by the shirt. That's from all the work I did in event analysis. Today, we're going to talk about maintaining frequency control and frequency response using inverters, because as the electric energy system moves from a largely carbon-based, large synchronous machine world, it's moving towards inverter-based resources. A lot of them are intermittent and have other issues that we'll talk about at some point in time, but nowhere is their influence more evident than in the area of frequency control and frequency response. System frequency is like the heart rate of the system, and it's indicative of the correct balance of the loads and resources that serve them. That balance must be constantly maintained by a system operations function called a balancing authority. They're responsible for keeping that balance through control action of governors, on generators, automatic generator controls, scheduling and purchasing of energy, and operational unit commitments, day ahead, hour ahead, minute by minute. The gazintas always have to equal the gazatas. If there's more generation than load, the system speeds up and the frequency rises. Conversely, if there's more load than generation, the system slows down and the frequency falls below 60 hertz, which we just saw in Texas with spades. So during normal operations, generators on AGC are given an output target, which vary every 4 seconds by the system control and data acquisition system to maintain frequency and to keep the tie line flows between the BAs to the desired level. However, when there's a loss of generation, that function has to be made up immediately. And the generators in that system must function in a thing called primary frequency response. The energy comes from operating with spinning reserves, that's unloaded portion of some generating capacity. And it's completely autonomous and an automatic action by the generators, the speed controllers, the governors. There's no manual interaction at first. The larger the resources, the greater the frequency dip. After about a minute, the AGC system throttles the other generators on the system to make up for the loss of generation. We could put up the first slide, please. That would be wonderful. On the upper part of the slide, is it there, Ralph? Okay. At any rate, on the upper part of this slide is a typical frequency excursion. You have a very steep drop-off when the energy is lost until the governors can kick in and make up for that lost power. Now, typically governors start reacting in about 3.5 seconds. So that becomes a real key issue going forward. Governors have a lot of moving parts, and so that they can't be expected to do things that we can do with inverters. Now, inverters are basically computer control systems. So you don't have to worry about the rotating mass of the generator getting in the way. However, as we continue to retire synchronous machines, we lose something called inertia. And inertia is the desire by the system to maintain its speed. But if there's less and less inertia, there's less and less reluctance to maintaining speed. This is exhibited when you have a very high rate of frequency change for a very large loss of generation. Now, as the inertia goes down, so too does it increases the rate of change of frequency. The higher the inertia, the lower the rate of change of frequency, and the lower the inertia, the higher rate of change of frequency. That means as it becomes lower, the Brock off is going to continue to get lower, deeper, and the frequency excursions will get deeper and steeper. That means you just can't catch up with it once it starts falling off the cliff. So let's go to the second slide now. We did some work with the ERCOT system a few years ago, looking at different load levels and different inertia levels. There are 3 graphs on this slide. And what the purpose was to take a look at what would be the primary frequency response needed to maintain your frequency response when you do have a problem. So in case 1, the black line, the net load is indicative of the level of inertia, and you need a primary frequency response of 1,300 megawatts. In case 2, you got half that load, probably about half the inertia, but the required frequency response jumps to 2,500 megawatts. In case 3, when your load is really small compared to the higher inertia values, that jumps all the way up to 4,700 megawatts of spinning resources that you would have to have just to maintain your system frequency. It's uncanny how this is very, very hard to do with conventional governors because they operate by the rules of physics. Fortunately, they're being supplanted by IBRs, which don't have that limitation. But what is really needed to replace the loss of energy is you've got to inject that replacement energy sooner into the system to arrest the frequencies sooner. That high-speed energy injection is often referred to as fast frequency response. Now, there's a standard being developed for inverter-based resources connected to sub-transmission and transmission systems. It calls for fast frequency response capability in order to happen in less than 1 second. That's from the time the frequency crosses prescribed deadband with a proportional, non-step response so that as it gets steeper, it works harder, and as it comes back out of its dip, it backs off, and so it's a proportional response. So most frequency excursions happen and have about 3 to 10 minutes. So as far as primary and secondary frequency are applied, it changes that time frame. When we have fast frequency response from something like a wind turbine, people sometimes call that synthetic inertia. There's no such thing. Okay, that's all it is doing and robbing the inertia of the rotating blade, turning it into electricity, but they've got to pay it back in about 6 to 20 seconds. That's far too short for what we need to do. But if you have IBRs that are lightly loaded or partially loaded, you could have a very effective fast frequency response system when you do that with the IBRs. If you've got batteries and you can apply battery power or some other energy storage system, it can be really very, very effective. So you got to do a couple of things. So IBRs have to be capable of independent, automatic, and cohesive response. They have to use some sort of interconnection-wide deadband. That's so they don't chatter against each other. And the proportional non-step response is a very important aspect. So that means the primary frequency response and fast frequency response can work together to arrest the frequency sooner and offset the effects of losing inertia. But you can't take all of the renewable resources at all of the time. That's like asking all the freshmen at Virginia Tech to drink all the beer in the stadium, and you keep pouring more beer into the stadium. It just doesn't work. Eventually, you will have way too much power. And the only way to shut it off right now, if it's on rooftop solar, is to shut somebody's power off. That's not a real good idea. So we got to do this a little bit better. So it's a challenge for sure. But boy, we have a very powerful tool in inverter-based resources to modify and handle frequency response and frequency control. Back to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Bob. And Matthew Gardner is back. We'll turn to him next. He is Director of System Protection with Dominion Energy's Power Delivery Group. And in this role, Matthew oversees the company's system protection organization, including both engineering and field operations responsibilities. He's got a passion for the development of technical talent for the electricity industry, and he's actively involved with many academic institutions and consortia, including his own Virginia Tech. Matthew, please tell us why the clean energy transition is a digital transformation.
Thank you, Ralph. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, you're fine.
All right, great. Thank you. You know, it's always difficult to follow Bob Cummings. He taught me much of what I know about anything that's associated with the word frequency. So I'm humbled to follow Bob. You know, so we come now to this matter of technology in the digital age, specifically within the context of leveraging technology to accelerate progress in our nation's clean energy transition. You know, for years, well over a decade, in fact, we've all acknowledged that the grid is changing. Bob's done a good job of teeing that up. And it's changing rapidly. But, you know, this statement's starting to feel a bit like a truism that we're powerless to influence, you know, kind of like death and taxes. But even death and taxes, as inevitable as they are not immutable. So by understanding our health and finances, we can find ways to increase our chances of living a longer life while reducing our tax burden along the way. And as with these classic truisms, diving deeper into the changing energy landscape exposes the many ways that we can influence and perhaps even define the evolution of the grid. So today I'd like to do just that at a high level. I'm going to share a perspective on how the grid is changing, why embracing a myriad of digital transformations is critical to success in our societal decarbonization goals as well. I'll start by treating three important aspects of how the underway clean energy transition is changing the grid and the role of technology in the digital age for managing this change and thereby delivering our clean energy future. So with respect to our nation's electric infrastructure, the clean energy transition can be defined, at least in my perspective, by three key changes. That's a change of scale, a change of physics, and a change of interfaces. I'll address each one of those in reverse order and then pivot to technology in this digital age. By changing interfaces, I'm referring to a change that's occurring in both the methods and the locations of how we interface with the grid on both the supply side or the generation side and also on the demand side or the load side. You know, certainly electrification, that whole narrative is a part of this, but I'm going to leave that for another panel. What I'm really getting at here is that both generation and load are increasingly interfacing to the grid via power electronics in a geographically diverse way. The implication of this is that our clean energy transformation is in fact a digital transformation. The inverter-based generation resources that are displacing conventional generation resources, as Bob was mentioning, either derive energy from a silicon source, as is the case with solar PV, or they convert energy with a silicon or similar power electronics interface, as is the case with wind and batteries. You know, these inverter-based resources no longer have the intrinsic properties of 800 tons of spinning steel, for example, as Bob was mentioning with inertia. You know, a similar trend has been underway for years on the load side of the equation. You know, in parts of the country, we're seeing load growth. It's common that the digital economy, that is data centers, is driving that load growth. And so I think we're going to see more of that with the emergence and adoption of electric vehicles and the whole space of electrification. It's going to underscore that point. You can even see this with a quick glance around your home or office just by looking at all of the devices that are connected to the grid via power electronics. Now, this shift to silicon puts a computer at the heart of the interface between generation and the grid. This creates what we can call software-defined interaction with the grid. As I'll demonstrate through my talk, this change is both a blessing and a curse, in that it creates challenges for the utility, but also provides creative solutions to complex problems. With such a rapid adoption of power electronics interface load and power electronics interface generation, the future is one of new temporal and dynamic behavior, a change of physics, if you will, which is the second key change I want to touch upon briefly. And I think Bob did a great job of going really deep here, so I'll hit it at a high level. By change in physics, I mean that things are happening faster and differently. Eroding away are the long multi-second inertia constants and generous outrushes of fault current intrinsic to the conventional large rotating generators that have heretofore defined system strength on the grid. This is a concern because the technical basis for protection and control of the grid is largely founded in these heretofore fixed and repeatable physics. To the extent that the grid has self-healing capabilities today, many of these abilities are intrinsic to a physics that are receding into history as a highly dynamic and nonlinear physics emerge. This shift in grid physics will necessitate new performance indicators to maintain and improve the grid. On the load side, a similar, less forgiving physics is emerging as well. In short, with power electronics driving the physics on both the energy supply side and the energy demand side of the equation, the future is emerging as one with power electronics-based technologies in the middle at the fulcrum, and that is within the T&D realm or on the wires. We've seen the first wave of this already. Over the last decade or so, as we've begun pivoting away from large coal generating stations, parts of our nation's electric grid have been bolstered by an order of magnitude growth in the deployment of power electronics-based devices like flexible AC transmission systems, HVDC, synchronous condensers, and the like. Our nation's clean energy transition is a digital transformation, and these transmission and ever increasingly distribution power electronics devices are technologies that are staged to grow potentially another order of magnitude and usher in the digital energy age. That third key change I was talking about is a change in scale. Our nation's electric grids have grown up around large generating stations and load centers. The clean energy transition is building upon that infrastructure, but the scales are different, and the hyper-connected vertices are no longer aligned with the largest and strongest energy sources on the grid. As a concrete example from my patch of the universe, Dominion Energy's traditional generation fleet includes a couple of dozen generation sites. Many of those sites have units that exceed 100 megawatts or more. But our renewable generation fleet is nearly 4 times that number, almost 100 sites. And by the end of this decade, we'll have over 400 sites. And really, in contrast to our traditional fleet, most of these sites have nameplate capacities well under 100 megawatts, many much, much smaller. And so this is what I mean by a change of scale. Grid topology that accommodated yesterday's generation portfolio is what we're going to have to start with for accommodating tomorrow's clean energy generation sources. Certainly, the grid will need to be rewired. We can expect significant transmission and distribution upgrades. However, the changes in scale, physics, and interfaces won't be solved by capacity alone. Wires won't be the whole solution, plain and simple. Beyond capacity, we need capability, and this is where technology fills the gap. Before we leave the topic of scale, we must acknowledge the scale of generation interconnection activity associated with this clean energy transition. Across the nation, generation interconnection request queues are breaking records that are only set to be broken again within months. With such high levels of activity being thrown at planners and eventually system operators around the country, the way we study and plan the grid is being fundamentally challenged. Models are breaking under the weight of multivariate studies that are no longer capable of delivering black and white solutions. Legacy heuristics are no longer in play. Models insufficient. So we now must leverage solutions like data analytics and more complex grid analysis to understand the changing grid. The future of grid planning will need to pivot to think beyond the box of deterministic model-based planning while embracing the value of big data, a mindset almost wholly new to this industry. So at a high level, I've defined a few changes that are intrinsic to our nation's clean energy transition while asserting that this transition is in fact a digital transformation. As I wrap up, I'll touch upon technologies that will drive this digital transformation and solve for the future. Speaking of solutions, we always have to start with the trivial solution, and that's data. As Lord Kelvin is attributed as saying, to measure is to know. The changes that I've discussed can only be addressed when measured. They can only be managed when measured. So for the grid, this means measurement, which implies sensor deployment and eventually manifests as data with a capital D. More than a decade ago, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act catalyzed a nationwide deployment of high-resolution grid monitoring devices that we call synchrophasers, or PMUs. Grid data from SCADA and energy management systems that were once denominated in gigabytes has now been eclipsed by synchrophaser data that reaches into the petabytes, or mega gigabytes. This rich data has already helped our nation unwind events in hours that once took days, weeks, or longer to understand. Just ask Bob Cummings. While data is a blessing, dealing with it can be a problem. Gone are the days of grad students researching the grid in any meaningful way based upon data stored on hard drives and passed around like I did with SneakerNet. No longer can we bring the data to our analytics. We must now take the analytic to the data. And so for our industry, this means embracing secure cloud-based analytics platforms, and there are good examples out there to be cited and used today. So the clean energy transition is a digital transformation. I'm going to say that over and over, and that can only be driven by data obtained from dense, high-resolution sensor networks, facilitated by equally dense, secure, and reliable communications networks. Future wires infrastructure will need to be accompanied by an equally important data infrastructure. In fact, we need to start thinking of data as infrastructure because data is an asset. Data is so easy to create, and the ease with which search engines and social media platforms mine data to curate our digital life at the swipe of a finger, that can trick us into thinking that dealing with data is easy. Nothing about data is easy. In fact, we need to pivot and start thinking of data as an asset that comes with a commitment to management. Beyond the trivial solution that is data, the technology platform of our digital age that will drive our clean energy transition has already been discussed in my talk already. That's power electronics. The faster dynamics, variability, and distributed nature of emerging load and generation are requiring flexibility in the middle. It's clear that our future will require a more flexible grid, comprising flexible AC transmission systems, but also other technologies such as HVDC, possibly reimagined with broader applications at lower voltages and going shorter distances. We've already seen that's what is old is new again, as our nation is seeing a renewed interest and investment in synchronous condensers. Synchronous condensers have physical properties that can supplement physical deficiencies that emerge as large rotating machines are displaced by inverter-based renewables. However, there is a word of caution here. Each of these new technologies that promise to deliver a more flexible grid are also in and of themselves highly dynamic, automatically regulated technologies. I think of the HVDC and FACT space as one of voltage management robots. That's right. Our nation's grids already have voltage management robots helping keep the lights on today. And the future will see hundreds, if not thousands more across the country's interconnections. Someone needs to direct traffic. Our engineers have already leveraged our big data analytics platforms to find conflicts in the operations of these devices. Here we see a recurring theme, a need for more sophisticated data-based modeling and analysis capabilities. While we're talking about technology, let's get back to that challenge of scale. It's no secret that generation interconnection queues are bursting at the seams across the nation, and our industry is stretching to solve for it. I'd like to propose that the tsunami of renewable energy interconnection requests will require a rethinking of how our nation develops and deploys infrastructure. A good example from my particular domain of expertise involves rapidly deployable controls and eventually rapidly deployable substations. Leveraging maturing digital technologies and protocols such as IEC 61850, the ability to rapidly procure and deploy standardized, mass-produced, prefabricated digital substations is quickly becoming a reality, just in time to meet a surge in demand. Further, innovations in gas-insulated switchgear are also showing promise for containerized, prefabricated, rapidly deployable substation infrastructure. A pivot away from the exclusively bespoke, stick-build, customized substations and controls will not only address the challenge of scale, but will also drive us towards digitization and standardization. Innovations like this in the short term could also drive long-term sustainable migration to the digitization of existing substations through IEC 61850 implementations. The benefits of this type of technology only grow as we progress towards decarbonization. At Dominion Energy, we're in the early days, but there's much activity and excitement that will snowball in the near term. So as I close, I want to make sure that we acknowledge what the future will require of us. It will require a workforce ready to construct, operate, and maintain our nation's emerging clean energy infrastructure. If we don't seize on the opportunity to digitize our technology as the nation's energy sources and sinks digitize, then we risk the creation of an anachronous gap where we have infrastructure that can only be supported by yesteryear's workforce. This will require policies at the federal and state levels to support these changes. Also, while I haven't had time to delve deeply into automation, it's inevitable that keeping up with our changing grids will require significant investments and developments in deep learning, artificial intelligence, automation, and perhaps even robotics. Inspired by applications of Boston Dynamics' robotic dog Spot, I see a future where substation inspections and maintenance activities involve Spot on the ground, while overhead, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs or drones, inspect our overhead lines and are dispatched to find faults on a timescale unimaginable today. Each of these technologies, while nascent today, already have velocity and acceleration that will bring them into the mainstream before this decade is out. And it won't come a day too soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Tongzhen Zheng is the Director, Advanced Technology Solutions at ISO New England. He is responsible for research and development in wholesale electricity market design, analysis and operations, smart grid, and emerging technologies in power system operation and control. He also oversees the development of market clearing and simulation software. He received his doctorate in electrical engineering from Clemson University. Tongzhen, floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Matt just talked about the digital transformation and the role of technology for the future grid. I'm gonna share. I can say that I share many similar thoughts on this on this technology with him. I'm gonna put the more focus on how technology can enhance the grid operational resilience. As many panelists discussed today, we have seen the increasing frequency of extreme weather events such as winter storms, hurricanes, and wildfires. Some of them have resulted in significant power losses for millions of customers. Therefore, I think grid resilience has become a very important topic for the power industry, as the grid is becoming a much more complex several physical system. To maintain the system reliability, I think grid resilience should be considered in the power system operation, planning, and the electricity market operation. And the resilience assessment framework should be established. Such framework should include the risk identification, impact assessment, and the resilience risk mitigation. Within this framework, we can develop strategies to grade resilience enhancement. I think there are many ways to improve system resilience, ranging from infrastructure hardening, establishing emergency operating procedures, to introducing new market products. In this talk, I will focus on the role of technology in risk identification and assessment. In particular, I think big data analytics, advanced modeling and analytical technique, and cloud computing are the three key technologies to improve grid operational resilience. So first of all, the big data analytics, such as machine learning and artificial intelligence, can be applied to system operation and help with identifying the resilience risk. As of today, ANN, which artificial neural network, has been successfully applied to load forecasting. However, the increasing level of renewables penetration has brought in many new challenges in the load forecasting and renewable forecasting. As this output is weather dependent, especially when under extreme weather conditions. The output of those resources can be significantly changed, causing issues for the control room operation. So enhancement in this area is needed. Another area that big data analytics can help with is outage prediction. As we know that extreme weather events will increase probability of component failure. It would be better to warn system operators the increasing risk of equipment outages and prepare them for possible preventive actions. Seeing this need, ISO New England had developed an online weather look-ahead study tool to predict future equipment outages due to severe weather conditions in the real-time operation. So after taking into consideration information of weather transmission system, GIS system state, and contingency definitions, the tool identifies the weather-related -k contingencies having elevated probability and assigns probabilities to all contingencies, including -1, -2 stock breaker contingencies. And in the end, it looks ahead a few hours in real time and visualize results in the control room. The probability assigned here is the conditional failure probability of the power transmission equipment subject to weather conditions. It is computed based on transmission line fragility curves in which the probability of a structure failure is represented as a function of wind speed or wind ice thickness on towers and wires. In the future, deep learning models with utility outage data will be developed to study other factors such as pre-trimming schedules, improved accuracy of equipment failure probability prediction. The second technology for enhancing grid resilience is advanced modeling and analytical techniques. Extreme weathers can put tremendous stress on the grids, including supply, transmission, distribution system, and even transportation systems. To assess the impact, we will need advanced analytical tool. New England system depends heavily on the natural gas system. Historical cold snaps have resulted in a loss of thousands of megawatts generation. To assess the supply side of impact, ISO New England had developed a gas usage utility, which runs every day and assess this gas pipeline system's readiness in meeting the gas units they had generation schedule. In addition, a 21-day energy assessment process is being established. The study is conducted every week and tries to identify potential issues in certifying system load forecasts based on the oil and LNG inventory levels and refueling schedules. So in addition to supply system impact studies, ISO has developed the online cascading analysis capability to evaluate the impact of transmission failures. Different from the N-1 security analysis where only single element failure is considered. The online cascading analysis tool dynamically identifies the impact of N-K contingencies or multiple components failures, which are often considered as rare events with high probability, high impact. The process models only fast developing cascading events during which the system operator have no time to react. The analysis contains two processes. One is steady state contingency screening, and the other one is a time domain cascading analysis. The screening process stimulates thousands of potential transmission outages with high conditional probabilities and the corresponding cascading failures. Computes the resulting generation and the load loss and ranks contingencies based on severity of supply and demand loss. About 100 highly ranked contingency will be further studied in the second process, that is time domain simulation. In the end, about 20 high megawatt impact contingencies will be presented to the system operator for further review. Combined with the results of online weather look-ahead study, the impact of cascading failure can be properly evaluated based on both impact and the probability. Corresponding mitigation actions can then be activated. And lastly, I want to talk about the cloud computing technology, and which can play a big role in the strengthening grid resilience. So in the future, many applications can be moved to cloud environment. For instance, ISO had developed a cloud-based emergency dispatch scheme under which system operator can still dispatch generators to maintain system balance in the event of the control room was compromised. Other applications such as wide area monitoring and situation awareness can be developed into the cloud. I believe in the long run, system operator may even be able to control the grids through the cloud. So to conclude, I believe existing technologies, although are not mature, will enhance this grid operational resilience by providing better grid monitoring capability, more comprehensive risk assessment method, and faster computing environment. However, a challenge remains in adopting these new technologies. I will I just list a couple of them for the future discussion. So one is the transition to the risk-based operations. The current NERC standard on security is deterministic. The question is how do we amend such existing standards by introducing probabilistic information? The second one is resilience metrics and the policies for risk mitigation. This really is about the risk reliability standard for tail risk. I think the industry practitioners, NERC and FERC, and stakeholders should work together to define the proper measure of such tail risk. So we can have a better plan. We can better plan and operate the system and provide a proper incentive for investing in with resiliency enhancement. The last one is cybersecurity enhancement and enhancement of SIP standard. I think this is going to be critical in adoption of the new technologies. This is all what I have, and thank you, and back to Rob.
Thank you. And we're going to close with Tom O'Brien, close the opening remarks. Tom joined PJM in April of 2002, and he is responsible for all activities related to PJM's Information Technology Services Division and its Enterprise Information Security. Tom is the vice chair of the Eastern Interconnection Data Sharing Network Board of Directors. And in earlier stints at GPU and First Energy Solutions, Tom held management positions in information technology and system operations, supporting portfolios for commodity sourcing, retail operations, and competitive generation. His degrees are from Shippensburg and LaSalle universities. Tom O'Brien.
Thank you, Ralph. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I hope you are all doing well through the pandemic. I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. I appreciate the comments from my fellow panelists and their interesting points of view. The energy transition, including digital transformation, resilience, and an evolution to a more renewable future, is an exciting time and demands a thoughtful approach to the implementation. I also appreciate
We'll just readjust for a moment to get Tom's camera back. We'll hope to continue with Tom O'Brien in a moment, but until he returns, I want to begin a Q&A session that is very much focused on trying to help develop an actionable agenda for the policymakers in this audience and those who are supporting them. And so I'll have some questions that I'll take the order, the initial questions in the same order as our speakers, which means that I'll be starting with Kenyon Wells. And Kenyon, straightforward initial question that's come to me. What policies should state and federal regulators consider to encourage development of resiliency efforts to overcome the loss of inertia and weakened system strength that we've heard so much about?
Well, thank you, Ralph. Thank you for the question. And I've really been enjoying everyone's presentation. There's a lot of different pieces to the puzzle that are being talked about. So I encourage all the rest of my panel, my fellow panelists, to jump in and if you have anything to add on any of these questions. I think the regulators are in as a challenge to position as the actual utilities industry, because the way they've engaged with the individual utility companies is going to have to change. For years, the regulators have rightfully been very focused in on protecting the customer and making sure that the rates being charged are appropriate. The utility industry has been very reliable, very solid business for a long, long time. That's being called into question as we go forward. Many of the current utilities companies are going to face significant challenges. Some will go under or be purchased, or other major transformations on the business side. The regulators need to engage with the companies, not just to protect the customer and make sure that the end rate is appropriate, but that there is an ongoing viable business for the utilities companies. And for some of them, that's going to be called into question. So the different regulators in different states are in very different situations, and depending on the health and how quickly some of the utility companies are moving to embrace this change and adapt, they're going to have to come up with different approaches. But primarily, but first and foremost, they need to start engaging with very open public discussions about the long-term future, not just thinking about the rates for the next couple of years or even the next 5 years, but over the next 10 years, how is each area, how is each region across the country going to change? What's the marketplace going to look like? And as we see these new entrants and as we see these new technologies come into the place, everyone is going to have to be much more flexible than we've been in the past.
And thank you for that. I see we have Tom back. So Tom, let's allow you to complete your opening remarks, and then I'll shift back to some of the other panelists. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. And I apologize. I'm not sure what happened there, but and I'll try to make it a little briefer, seeing we lost some time. But I just want to emphasize that at PJM, as a very large power grid operator, we recognize and embrace our role to support a reliable and efficient energy transition. Reliability is our first priority, along with competitive markets and regional planning. And we are also working more and more with stakeholders and policymakers to support the future of the grid, which also includes grid resilience. The growth of renewables is accelerating at a rate, with over 90% of the projects in our interconnection queue being solar, wind, storage, and hybrids. So while PJM doesn't rank as high as other ISOs and RTOs from a renewable penetration perspective, we are expected to see significant growth over the next decade. A key focus of my comments includes consideration of cybersecurity. The EnVision Forum speaks to the implications of an energy transition, and there are key considerations for the future of cybersecurity. Technology breakthroughs and acceleration will be a constant, and it's an exciting time for the industry. My fellow panelists highlighted the advancements of big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, analytics, advances in automation. The transition to new enabling technologies, including distributed energy resources and cloud computing, requires us to double down on cybersecurity. Our adversaries are becoming increasingly capable and determined, and this is evident through the high consequence offenses we've seen from nation states and criminal actors. We need to keep our eyes wide open and demonstrate a sense of humility. I say humility because we never assume that we have all of our bases. The recent global cybersecurity supply chain attacks are just one example of why we must remain vigilant. We must continue to build from our current successes and practices while seeking continuous improvement through the transition. There are a few core cybersecurity principles that we expect will stand the test of time, and I'll quickly highlight those. First, collaboration. Collaboration across industry and government partners is essential to managing cybersecurity in today's complex environment. More than ever, cybersecurity is the ultimate team sport. Secondly, threat intelligence. We must understand the threat landscape and gain strategic intelligence that informs our priorities and drives proactive cybersecurity management. We must continue to work with our government partners and vendors to share relevant information that we can use to detect and defend against attacks, ensuring protection of systems and data. The Electric ISAC continues to develop and mature as the key information sharing hub for the electric sector, and our continued support is imperative. And thirdly, we need to utilize a disciplined cybersecurity framework to integrate standards, best practices that allow us to measure our performance. The framework must ensure fundamental blocking and tackling to prevent attacks, effective monitoring and utilization of automation to detect attacks, preparation by performing effective drills and exercises that practice our incident response plans, and rapid recovery plans. To reiterate, the core principles of collaboration, threat intelligence, and disciplined cybersecurity framework will stand the test of time. However, we must build new successes and capabilities. We must continually improve as we consider the cybersecurity implications driven by energy innovation, technology advancements, and a more distributed energy landscape. We are becoming more interconnected every day. That will only accelerate in the future. This includes some key areas for consideration. The overall attack surface is growing rapidly as an exponential number of devices are connecting to our operational and information technology networks, and we need to rethink trusted networks. The volume of data exchange between counterparties, including distribution, generation, and transmission facilities, will continue to grow with distributed energy resources, and we need to manage those data exchanges. Cybersecurity tools must continue to be enhanced to support the volume of information that is reflective of the digital transformation. We must develop more machine-to-machine data integration that supports high volumes of security logs, alerts, and indicators of compromise. We must develop new and enhance advanced data-driven analytics platforms to aid in monitoring and human performance challenges. Similarly, implementing advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence into our cybersecurity operations centers will support the human factor in the cybersecurity battle. If I could leave you with just only one point, it would be the importance of scaling our cybersecurity practices in the distributed world. We need to consider new boundaries in data management as we extend our data into broader distributed environments. It is clear that several factors are converging to increase future cyber risk for the energy sector. To highlight again, the energy transition and digital transformation result in an expansion of the potential attack surface on our operational networks. The core principles and best practices remain the same, but the scale upon which we need to consider those principles is increasing. Collaborating across the industry and with our government partners is essential. Understanding the threat landscape and intentions of the adversaries is critical. And utilizing a cybersecurity framework to integrate industry standards and best practices provides the foundation. In addition to the current best practices, we must continue to evolve our cybersecurity maturity and toolbox, adapt to the changing landscape, and continue developing cybersecurity talent. The energy transition, including digital transformation, resilience, and an evolution to a more renewable future is an exciting time and demands a thoughtful approach to the implementation. That thoughtful approach needs to consider cybersecurity. I'd like to thank you for your participation. Look forward to your questions, and I apologize for the technical issue at the start.
Not at all. And as we now continue my effort to further enlarge upon our actionable agenda for policymakers, many of whom have spent the day hearing about an accelerating pace of change and threat, and perhaps feeling ever so slightly concerned, my panelist job for the remainder of the minutes before us is simply to cheer everyone up a bit. And in that spirit, Bob, the question I have for you isn't necessarily designed very well for that purpose, but I think it's a good one, and I'm happy to give it to you. Does the increase in inverter-based devices on the transmission and distribution networks require changes in the way we black start the systems from extreme events, and a need for new policies to support such changes?
That's always a good question, and the answer is very complex. The answer is yes. It will require a very big difference in how we black start the system. First of all, the inverters have to be capable of grid forming, which means they can synthesize a 60 hertz signal to get themselves started. So they have to have that capability. Without that, the rooftop solar on your house, if they turn off the power in your neighborhood, it can't power your house. If you had attached to a battery, it can power your house. So there's some misconceptions there that are going to have to be overcome. I got started in this industry with the 65 blackout. My dad worked at a power plant that provided the startup power, the black start power, with a big 11 power loop in New England. And that's how I got interested in all this stuff. So it's going to be a different thing. There will be far more possible paths for cranking to other generators, but we're also going to have to be able to have adaptive controls so that I can tie this part of this grid together with this part of the grid and then get them to operate together. All during this time, you have to maintain that exact balance between load and the resource. So, and with the controls of an inverter, you can do that way too fast and you can destabilize the system very quickly. So you actually have to do this in a very measured form. And if you have rotating machines involved at all, it further complicates the issue. So hope that covers the basis.
I think it does. Matthew, you opened the door to this question. I want to press you on it. Can we be ready in time if there is an accelerating electrification trend in the transportation and heating sectors? What infrastructure is needed, when, and how should policymakers enable this investment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you hear me, Ralph?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think the overall answer is yes, we can be ready, but it won't necessarily be easy, and not all parts of the country are starting from the same point. So I think we'll see that parts of the country with heavier air conditioning loads and heat pump loads may be a little further ahead in the wires infrastructure, especially at the distribution level, just because of the environment that those systems have evolved in over time. But to answer the question, what infrastructure is needed? Certainly, wires infrastructure is going to be a part of that. But I think one of the key things to understand in all of this is that it's not going to stop with wires infrastructure. We don't just need a bigger boat. I mean, we don't just need a bigger pipe or a bigger wire. We also need to make sure that that infrastructure is developed based upon data. And so I think where we will first see the focus is on looking for leading indicators of acceleration in electrification within sectors, and of course certain utilities can be a part of that. But that will help prioritize the circuits and the infrastructure that is prioritized first. I think the real key thing from a regulatory perspective is to realize that beyond wires, we might see infrastructure that's smart infrastructure, it's power electronics based infrastructure that is goes beyond the capability component, goes beyond the capacity component and starts to address that issue of capability. So today, the immediate need, I think, is analytics to fill the gap. One other thing to realize is that this change is likely going to be exponential in nature, almost like a pandemic. We have a good example of that, right? It starts slowly at first. I mean, cast your memory back to last year, December through January, February, there was some virus circulating. Then all of a sudden, it was everywhere and escalating. And I think that's the type of thing we need to keep a beat on in this transition, is that it will be exponential in nature. And so slowly at first, and then seemingly out of nowhere, rocket up.
But we can do it.
Yeah, that's right. We can do it.
I saw Bob. I see your hand up. Go ahead. And Bob,
I think Matt is exactly right. But my biggest concern in electrification of vehicles and such is that we don't have the resources. We're rapidly destroying resources that could possibly fill those batteries and charge them, because there's no sun happening in the middle of the night to charge your battery. So I get home at night and I want to charge my car. I got to have that power coming from someplace. And if it's not coming from sun, if it's coming from wind, well, hopefully the wind's blowing. So I think that's going to be one of the largest hurdles.
Okay. Next, I'm going to turn to Tongzin, and you made very clear in your remarks that with weather as an increasingly important consideration in resource adequacy, we're going to have increasing data needs. And this questioner asks, well, talk about what those increasing needs really are concretely and how we're going to meet them. What are we going to need to do? What do policymakers have to be thinking about to make sure we're ready to handle the challenge that you outlined?
Great questions. As you can see that we have seen in the past in extreme weather events, brought significant damage to the middle part of the grid. So you can see that including the supply system and transmission system and communication system, and even on the demand side. So as a balancing authority and reliability coordinator, I think ISO and RTOs will be extremely concerned about reliable operation under such events. The system operator will need new tools to continuously monitor the evolving system conditions, as they predict and identify the increased risk and quickly assess the system impact of the identified risk and develop mitigation plans, that including both preventive and corrective actions. I would say that different from existing tools, and those new tools must be able to take into consideration of those low probability and high impact events, perhaps based on the conditional probabilities. So therefore, you're going to need additional information to drive those new tools. For example, apparently, weather-related information will be needed. For example, temperature, dew point, cloud coverage, wind speed, snow, lightning, those kind of information. So this information will be needed, will be used to predict renewables, electricity demand, and even natural gas consumptions. And also as illustrating in my presentation, that the equipment outages can be derived from those information. So they also about the information about the fuel delivery system is really also very important for the electric system operator to better predict the region's energy delivery risk. This is particularly true for a region that such as New England, because our system is heavily dependent on the natural gas systems. So the information about natural gas pipelines and the gas delivery, supply delivery schedules, and the key compressor stations, those information, it will be very important for us to make a better forecast and prediction of the supply system conditions. As you can see, some of the information are readily available from the gas pipeline system operator, OEIA, or some of them are not readily available. For example, some key compressor station information. So we need somebody, or maybe with the policyholders, regulatory, to help us to identify those data and to make better use of it from the electricity, from the power, from the grid perspective.
Got it.
So we also going to need some historical weather-based outage status statistics from NERC, transmission availability data system, and the infrastructure and environmental conditions in order to predict the probability of facility failures. And this normally this information is available from transmission owner. So at last, you can see that the PMU measurement of a key transmission locations also will provide the information about the state of the grid, and this can also drive many applications such as oscillation, source locations, and the status mission. So those are the information I think going to be used, going to be needed for the future. I'll say for the future grid. and this can be becoming extremely important for the grid planning, operation, and electricity market operation.
Thank you. Tom, the next question goes to you, and it's a related one. With the increased incidence of extreme events, do you see a need for enhanced interdependencies between the electric sector and other infrastructures to ensure appropriate recovery responses? And assuming the answer is yes, what policies should be encouraged to ensure that we get those interdependencies in planning the future grid?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. And I think you're absolutely right. The answer is yes, that during a significant event, interdependencies between critical structures are becoming increasingly important. And I'll just quickly highlight two is if you stop and think about system restoration without telecommunications, that's a huge issue. And so the relationship between telecommunications and electric is critical. Similarly, the gas supply is to generation. The interdependencies between those are really important. I think from a regulation perspective, I think we need to start bringing together the standards across those critical infrastructures and having everybody performing drills and exercises. I think NERC has done an outstanding job with the GridX exercises and the CEO tabletop exercises. I think we got to expand that more broadly, and I think we can do that with the support of more standards and perhaps more regulation. But I know that regulation isn't all coming from the same regulatory body, so that's a challenge to work out. Thanks.
Okay. I want now to take a couple of questions that have just popped up on my screen from folks at FERC. I have, first of all, a question for Bob, which is, will fast and reliable communications such as 5G offer better power sharing between inverters for better frequency control? I think this is a chance to cheer someone up, Bob.
They can for frequency control, but as far as frequency response goes, that really needs to stay in the realm of autonomous, isolated reaction. At an IBR plant level, it was perfectly fine. But you got to remember, a governor is just one governor. And what happens in frequency in the transients realm here is not what happens in California. So you want the response to come from where the problem is. In the Florida event back in 2008, we had our under frequency load shedding actuated, but it only actuated on part of the peninsula because the frequency did not decay as far or as fast in other parts of the system. And by the time it got to Georgia, that had been mitigated. So you want to have the combination. You want to have very high communications between the plant controllers and the individual IBRs, but you want to have a cohesive, coordinated effort across a fleet or distributed energy resources or whatever they may be. 5G will offer a lot of that, but again, as Tom was talking about, this offers another attack vector for playing with cybersecurity. So it's a two-edged sword.
Matthew, another FERC questioner asks about your level of confidence in protection systems to accommodate bidirectional flows of electricity, by which is meant electricity flowing from transmission to distribution system and from DER to distribution system. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good one. And it kind of harkens back to one of the points that Ed Bain made as he opened up our panel today. And that is, that the distribution networks really need to be configured for bidirectional flow. So what that means practically for us from a technical perspective is that technologies that are presently in use today at the transmission system will likely see implementation, on the distribution system. Let me just give you a couple of examples. With DERs coming onto the distribution grid, I think we will start to challenge a very common paradigm that's in place across the nation today, and that's the paradigm of protecting the distribution grid via overload type protection. I think that will start to erode away. We'll have to look towards differential type protections, impedance-based protections. Those are all in place today at the transmission level and at the substation level, but what we'll see is we'll need to see their implementation at the distribution level. And so there are implications in terms of, telemetry, instrumentation, communications networks that will make all of that happen. Another key area just to keep in mind is that for years and years, we've had anti-islanding schemes on the transmission network so that we don't inadvertently create these little islands on the transmission system if the system breaks up. That same type of technology is going to be making its way onto the distribution grid as well. So those are two examples. The science is there in terms of how the protection is done. I think it now comes down to getting the technology pushed into the distribution grid, and that will take some doing by the industry, but I think doable.
All right, now we're in our final 5 minutes. I'm going to have a question for the group. You get 1 minute each. We're going to start with Kenyon and run through the sequence again. And the question is one that I think usefully sums up the entire panel. From a technological standpoint, what are the most significant obstacles to completing the clean energy transition? Kenyon, you go first.
One of the business challenge of the current regulatory regime and the rate structure, the restrictions that puts on the utilities, the companies to make the investments and to move quickly. We've got to be more flexible in the way that regulators and the companies work together to come up with their plans.
Bob?
I think the biggest problem is going to be recognizing that 1,000 megawatts of wind is not equal to 1,000 megawatts of solar, is not equal to 1,000 megawatts of gas. The capacity factors are all different, and all the load balancing is going to have to be done on an instantaneous 5-minute basis. And you're going to have to know everything there is to know about all those interruptible or inadvertent resources. So it's going to become a bigger challenge, but regulators need to recognize the megawatt is not a megawatt. It has to be thought of in time. It has to be thought of in terms of energy limitations.
Matthew.
Yes, I think one key point is to realize that the technologies that have gotten us to where we are today are not going to get us to where we need to be tomorrow. So as I mentioned in my talk, I think that, we need to awaken to the fact that, we're not going to be able to simulate our way into the future. We really need to pivot and really start to focus on, pulling in rich data sets and leveraging cloud computing for planning the future grid. And I just want to make one key point here, and that is that some of the advancements that we've made in the enterprise business intelligence space is not necessarily portable to some of the technology and data sets that we're talking about in the grid space from the dense high resolution data sets and sensor networks that are going to need to be placed out there to study this. So there still is some room for improvement in terms of fully dimensioning out the full stack of technologies that we're going to need for the future.
Tongzin.
Hi, I want to echo what Bob said. I think it is very important to recognize when we talk transition to the clean energy. So system balancing is very important, as you can see that from system operation perspective. And this is particularly true when you say that if we're going to have 100% of renewables over there, so we need a mechanism to identify what are the balancing requirements for the system and what should be the right criteria there, reliability criteria under the new paradigm. So as I talked in my presentation about resilience and how resilience will be considered and what kind of reliability criteria it should be for consideration of tail events. And I think that I mentioned in my presentation that stakeholders and the regulatory bodies should come together and work it out.
Thank you. Tom, you get the last word.
And just very quickly, I would say the biggest challenge is to ensure that we go through this transition in a reliable and responsible manner. And we need to engage stakeholders, federal, state, and all types of stakeholders in the process, and just recognize that the scale and the pace of the change impacts all of that. I just think we need to come together to make all that happen. Thanks.
The collaborative spirit of this panel and the two that preceded it has been an inspiration. I began my remarks with an analogy to 2005 to remind us that sometimes we can outperform our expectations rather dramatically. I predict with confidence that this group will do it again in the years ahead. It is only appropriate that we close by hearing from the person whose idea this forum was, Commissioner Chatterjee.
Good afternoon. It's been a fantastic day one of EnVision, but at least here in DC, it's an absolutely gorgeous afternoon. So I won't keep you too long so we can all close out of our computers and be ready to hit the ground running tomorrow. I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on the day and say thank you to everyone who came together to make it a success. We covered a ton of ground in today's 3 sessions. It was time well spent looking ahead and discussing how our grid can and should evolve in the years to come. Today's discussions were so timely because we're in a moment of great change. We have the momentum to make huge strides in modernizing our energy systems and creating a cleaner, more reliable grid to power the future for the next generation. But to be done effectively, big changes require everyone to be rowing in the same general direction, and that's where events like EnVision come in. We may not agree on everything. In fact, we most certainly will not. But we can agree on the challenges we need to tackle and begin to pivot and face them together. So that's why it's an honor to be here with the leaders and thinkers gathered today. Not only those speaking on the panels, but everyone joining us virtually to engage on these issues. Before I close, I want to thank our moderators and speakers for sharing their time and talents with us. EnVision is only possible because you were willing to jump in and be a part of it. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in virtually today. The same goes for you. We want these dialogues to be far-reaching, and your participation is what made today a success. I want to extend my deep thanks to my esteemed co-chairs and the EnVision Steering Committee, which is a group of enormously talented experts who've spent a lot of time thinking about today's content and how to bring meaningful ideas to the forefront. And I want to thank our organizing committee, and in particular, Brandy Salmon and Karen Clark from Virginia Tech, who did amazing work to deliver this event. I want to give a shout out to my colleagues on the commission for their support, including Chairman Glick and Commissioners Clements and Christie for being a part of our programming. And finally, I want to thank John Umberger and Rachel Marsh for my team. John and Rachel are truly gifted, and their behind the scenes work made today possible. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us. We'll see you right back here again tomorrow.